So the story that I'm privileged to share with you now, I want to front load with two thoughts. The first is that this is a story of the thing that I've gotten to do in my life that has been the most meaningful, that I've been blessed to be able to do. And the second is that it's not a story that would exist without Join for Justice, and in this case specifically Mayor Lakin, who is our director of organizing, my mentor, my teacher. So in the last chapter of my life, before I joined the team at Central Synagogue, I joined that team about a year and a few months ago. I was, in fact, the co-director of Just Congregations, which is the community organizing arm of the Reform movement. And I was working with all of the Reform congregations in the country, and specifically in California, who wanted to be doing systemic political justice change work. And it was not long before it became really, really clear that in California, the rabbis and the congregations had an appetite, a deep hunger for doing something that allowed them to act not just as the congregational fiefdoms that can sometimes exist, doing the work on their own, which was wonderful work, but they had this hunger to be bigger than the sum of their parts. And so could we build something together as a California movement of the Reform movement? And so we started to explore what that could mean, and together we dreamed up and then built what we called Reform California, double entendre intended. We reform, yeah, you get it. In which we figured out that we could actually be bigger than the sum of our parts and organize in partnership across lines of race, class, and faith, better and stronger and more powerfully if we did something together. And so there was a leadership team. We built about 15 to 20 rabbis from around the state. And then that team, with others, through having conversations with hundreds of Reform rabbis and ultimately congregants as well, asking them the question, what is the California that you dream of? And at the same time doing research with experts in California to learn what are the issues on the ground? What could we do? If we were to put our weight behind something, point our ship somewhere, where could we have some real impact? And so those conversations, coupled with the research that we did, they determined that the first thing that we would do would be to try to pass a piece of legislation called the Trust Act. The Trust Act, I heard a little, Trust Act. Trust Act was statewide immigration reform legislation. And it's more complicated than this, but the short of it was that passing the Trust Act would protect 3 million immigrants in California, the most vulnerable of which particularly were survivors of domestic abuse, witnesses of crimes, people who were arrested for driving around with a broken taillight, who, if they were to come into contact with police because of a federal piece of legislation that existed, it was very, very likely that they would end up getting deported. Ripped from their families as part of a punishment, either for something they had done wrong, or just because they got their fingerprints taken, and the next day they wouldn't get to be there anymore. This felt untenable to us for lots of reasons, and so with about 100 rabbis on board, we joined the Trust Act Coalition. So this was the National Day Laborers Organizing Network, and it was the Asian Law Caucus, and it was PICO California, and a bunch of organizations that were all working on this together, because we decided we didn't want to do something alone. We didn't want to help those people. We didn't want to do parallel work. We wanted to organize with. This is something that Join teaches really deeply. We wanted to be part of and allies. Yeah. So there were a few things we needed to do. We needed to get this piece of legislation through the Assembly, through the Senate, and then the governor needed to sign it. This is a piece of legislation that the governor had vetoed twice in the 2 years leading up to this already. So we knew that was far off, but we'll get to Governor Jerry Brown in a second. We ran a ton of different strategies to get this thing through both houses. One of the most important things we had to do, obviously, was get enough legislative votes, often in districts where this piece of legislation was nowhere near the radar of these elected officials. But those are the places we live. We live sometimes in red districts, like Stockton and Bakersfield. And so we brought this, we white, mostly Jews, to the table as something that really mattered to us, that immigration was really important to us as Jews. The final strategy that we had moving it through the legislature was we took 60 people to Sacramento. And we met with all our legislators, we met with the governor's office. There was a great moment where Rabbi Larry Raffel was standing, talking to his legislator, surrounded by some of his congregants, and another senator, bless you, walks by and says, hey, Rabbi. Well, he was wearing a kippah, so Rabbi. So he says, hey, Rabbi, are you guys here to talk about Israel today?
Yeah.
And Rabbi Raffel turned to him and said, oh no, we're here to make sure that the Trust Act gets passed. And he stopped in his tracks, and he said, is that a Jewish issue? And Larry said, oh, we believe it is.
Yeah, great.
Oh. So that was a great day. Finally, it passes both houses. Now we've big celebration, big victory. But now we've got Governor Brown. So Governor Brown, the goal now was to get him to sign a piece of legislation that he didn't want to sign. He didn't need to sign it, and he has a very close relationship with the sheriff's union, who is opposed to this. And so we needed to figure out how to get this in his self-interest, get him to want this as much as we did. And so with the coalition, we started working on figuring out how to do that. It had been radio silence. Nobody could get a meeting with the governor. We didn't know what he was thinking. He wouldn't meet with the co-sponsors of the bill. He wouldn't meet with the coalition. So we run a strategy, our last strategy of this campaign. Rosh Hashanah, we invited all of the rabbis of Reform California to preach their Rosh Hashanah sermon on the importance of being a Jew who protects immigration and stands up for immigrants, and to ask their congregants to break the switchboard and to call the governor during the 10 days of awe and tell him, sign this bill, governor, that is on your desk right now, and Shana Tova.
Excellent.
3 things happened. 1, dozens of rabbis preached. 2, 1,000 of our base, of our Reform Jews, called and indeed broke the governor's switchboard. We say that in this work, the action is in the reaction. So in one of the synagogues, there was a man named Ari Emanuel. Perhaps you know him. If you've ever seen the show Entourage, that's him. And he heard it. He heard his rabbi preach that this is not okay. And he said, I cannot believe that this is happening in my state. And a coalition that really had trouble getting this conversation with the governor going, before Rosh Hashanah was over, he had scheduled a meeting for himself, his rabbi, Rabbi Ken Jason, and Governor Brown. And they had a conversation, and we worked on, how do we use our magic 7 minutes with the governor. And the governor was amazing, but I'll tell you how that call began. Ari Emanuel began the call by saying, so Jerry, Ari, said, so I was sitting in shul on Rosh Hashanah praying for my soul, and I heard my rabbi say this, Ken? That was amazing. All of these 3 parts, though. There was the moral voice that could inspire the base. There was the base that represented tens of thousands of votes. And then there was a person who represented a very powerful voice in this system and in the interest of the governor. And so I will tell you that on October 5th, I woke up to a phone call from the leaders of the coalition who said, he just signed the bill.
Yay!
And I cried. It was Shabbat, and it felt like a little bit of a taste of the world to come. And I just want to go back to the first statement that I said to you, which is we impacted the lives of 3 million immigrants, human beings, moms, dads, kids, who didn't have to think that maybe they'd be gone the next day. And there is no way that this could have happened without the learning that I've done with Join, with Mayor, who's been my mentor. We were on the phone weekly, and he agitated me, and we troubleshooted, and we problem solved, and we dreamed together. And I am forever grateful to join for this moment. Reform California is now on their 4th statewide campaign, so we haven't lost yet.